start in lab, so we'll do that lab C. In lab, we're gonna head to the respiratory system. So we can get a jump start on our studying for our lab exam. Just put a star by your name and I'll have you that, okay? Okay, here we go. Okay, so let's head into the respiratory system. And see all the structures that are required to get air down into the deep recesses of the lungs, where we have what happening?
Breathing.
What's gonna happen to the deep recesses of the lungs? Gas exchange, right? We have to get the air down into the, where we have the air sacs that are gonna allow for that gas exchange deep in the lungs. We have to get it from outside of us to deep into the lungs. So let's see how that happens. And all the structures that are involved for respiration. Okay. So that's the job, that's the role, the function of respiration is to get oxygen delivered to all of the tissues in the blood. So we're gonna see how the circulatory system, we're looking at the heart, is connected to the respiratory system. Right? How the heart is gonna send blood over to the lungs, drop off carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen that we breathe in. Okay? And that blood is gonna head to where gas exchange is happening in the lungs, drop off carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen. The now oxygenated blood will be delivered throughout the whole body. So we're delivering oxygen to our body for our cells to use, right? As they're working, as they're metabolizing, as they do cellular respiration, as they take glucose and oxygen and make ATP. That's our energy source, okay? We have to give them oxygen. While they're doing that, going through the process of making ATP, very important energy molecule, they are producing carbon dioxide. And that's why we have to eventually breathe that out, because it's a waste product of our cells respiring. Okay? So we have the processes that are involved in the respiratory and circulatory system that respiratory system is connected to the circulatory system in that way. The respiratory system is also connected to speech, right, and smell, right, olfaction, that we covered when we did our senses. All right. So the different processes of respiration are breathing, which is pulmonary ventilation, bringing air in and out into the lungs. And then external respiration. That's where we have this gas exchange between the lungs and the blood that gets sent to the lungs by the heart. All of this is happening in the respiratory system. But included in the process of respiration is what's happening internally, okay? So we have the transport of the oxygen, as well as carbon dioxide that we have to get rid of. That's getting transported through the blood. And then we have internal respiration. And this is where we get the exchange of gases between what's traveling in the blood, so like oxygen in the blood, with the tissues in order to service the cells in the body. That's a part of the circulatory system. Getting that oxygenated blood to the tissues, delivering it to them, and then picking up their waste product, carbon dioxide, getting that back into the respiratory system so that we can breathe out that carbon dioxide. So when it comes to the anatomy of the major organs that participate in the respiratory system, of course, we're talking about our noses, right? Our nasal cavities, our sinuses, our paranasal sinuses, those sinuses that are around our nasal cavity. the larynx, the trachea. We're gonna head into our bronchi, and then those are gonna branch and branch and branch and branch until we finally get to the very small structures within the lungs, the alveoli. And these are the structures where we have gas exchange occurring between the lungs and the blood. All right, so we're gonna take our trip through the respiratory system, from the lungs, all the way through the nasal cavity, down the pharynx, headed into the larynx, through the trachea, either going to the right or the left through a bronchi. And then while we're in the lungs, we branch and branch into smaller and smaller conduits until finally we reach the very small alveoli where gas exchange happens. This respiratory system is divided into two zones. We have the conducting zone that's going to bring air, conduct air into the deep recesses of the lungs, where we then enter into the respiratory zone. And that's the site of gas exchange in the very small air sacs called the alveoli. Okay, so these are microscopic structures down in the respiratory zone, where we have very small bronchioles, okay, that lead us into these alveolar ducts that then actually take us into alveolar sacs. Those sacs are filled with these grape-like structures called the alveoli. So it looks like a bunch of grapes. This is where we're gonna have gas exchange. The conducting zone, right? Coming in the nose and headed all the way down to the conducting zone. These are the conduits that are gonna get us down into the respiratory zone. And while the air is in the conducting zone, it's getting cleaned, it's getting warmed, it's getting humidified, so that we're breathing in clean and sending down into our respiratory zone clean, warm, humidified air. Ever breathe in cold air? Doesn't feel so good, right? So we like to get that warm, cold, dry air when hurt. So we clean it and also warm it up and humidify it. So let's consider the pathway of air. Oh, this is like the pathway. We go from here, arrow to there, arrow to here. It's like a pathway we should remember. Starting at our external nares, our nostrils. The nostrils of the nose. From there we enter, we go through what's called the vestibule. You want to go at church, you got the vestibule, the little outer area where everybody, the vestibule, right there behind our nostrils, okay? We go in, from there into the nasal cavity, where the superior, inferior, and the middle nasal concha, and the meatus in between. That's what we're gonna see there. Okay? So we pass through that vestibule, behind the external nares, the nostrils. Okay? The vestibule, the nasal vestibule, is where we see the hairs of the nose. Very important function of the hairs are catching anything, so it doesn't go into our respiratory system. And then we flow into the nasal cavity, where we find the nasal concha, inferior, middle, and superior, with the meatus in between them. Those are responsible for swirling the air around up against the wet respiratory epithelium, wet and warm respiratory epithelium, so that that air gets moist and warmed. Okay, let's head into the nose, providing a passageway for air. Okay, it filters and cleans it as the air. Those hairs are catching anything. Okay. It also houses what our olfactory receptors, right? Our olfactory epithelium lining on the superior nasal concha. It also acts as a resident chamber for speech. Our external nose. We have our apex, tip of our nose. We'll see the bridge, the ala. What's ala mean? Every place in the body. Ala is a wing. The ala. Okay. The philtrum. Ever wonder what this groove right here is? That's your philtrum. Okay, and then our external nares, the nostrils. Okay, see those structures. Here we go. Uh-oh, remember epicranius? Okay, there's the root and the bridge of the nose. Okay, this is the dorsal nasi, the dorsal part of the nose. And then we head where we have our apex, the tip of the nose, and the ala, the wings of the nostrils of the nose, which are our nares. Our external nares, hinting that there must be some internal nares, openings. We have cartilages associated, right? We can feel those cartilages in our nose, right? Associated with our nose. Once we head into the nose, we're gonna be in the nasal cavity. And in the nasal cavity, as we enter through the external nose, okay? We're going to eventually get swirled around the nasal cavity, and eventually we're gonna exit the nasal cavity through apertures in the back of the nasal cavity. Those are our internal nares. Okay? So the nasal cavity itself is divided by a septum. Who's making that septum? Well, what two bones are making that septum? Ethmoid and vomer, right? Making that septum. Yep. So have our septum dividing the nasal cavity, right? And we have our apertures that are going to lead us out of the nasal cavity into the pharynx. And the pharynx, we're going to see, has three different parts to it. The part behind the nasal cavity is the nasopharynx. When it comes to our nasal cavity, right, it has a roof and a floor. The roof is made by the ethmoid bone. The floor of it is made by the hard palate. So in between those is our nasal cavity. All right, check that out. So we enter in, we're all molecules of oxygen. We're being breathed in. We're gonna come into the external nares. Think about the pathway of air. Coming into the external nares. We'll be in the nasal vestibule where the hairs are. We're gonna get cleaned. Any large particles that get captured by the hairs will get captured by the hairs right here for us. Okay, we're gonna come into the nasal cavity. We're gonna swirl around the nasal concha and theata. And as we're getting swirled around, we're getting moistened, we're getting warmed up. Okay? And then we're gonna continue back throughout of the internal nares. Here's the internal nare, which is the posterior aperture opening. So we're going to leave the nasal cavity through the internal nare. And then from there, we're going to enter into the pharynx. And we're going to enter into this part of the pharynx, the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx. And then as air, we're going to continue to travel down the pharynx behind the oral cavity. The pharynx changes names, just changes names, to the oral pharynx. Then we're going to continue to behind the larynx. Is what is the laryngeal pharynx. And from the laryngeal pharynx, we can go two ways. We can go forward into the larynx and head into the respiratory system, or we can head down into the esophagus and go into the digestive tract. We'll get to that when we do digestive tract. Okay? But as air, we get ready to get pushed over into the larynx, right? We go down to the digestive tract, and that's gonna make us gassy, right? And we don't want air to come into food to come into the larynx, because then that's gonna be in the respiratory tract, make us choke. Okay? So we're gonna see how does the body control food not coming into the respiratory tract, food not coming into the larynx. We'll see how that happens. All right, so we travel into those external nares, and enter into that nasal vestibule where those vibrissae, those hairs, vibricide, those hairs are catching any particles that are coming in. And we're getting warmed and everything as we're bumping up against that mucosa, that respiratory mucosa, the wet mucus secreting epithelium in the nasal cavity. We also find our olfactory epithelium, mucosa, bathed in mucus in order to dissolve those, what do we call those chemicals that we smell? Those odorants dissolved in mucus, all lining that superior nasal concha. All right, here we are. This is the model that we're going to see. We come into those external nares. We're in the nasal vestibule. We're getting cleaned by the hairs here. And we head into the nasal cavity that's swirled around the superior, inferior, and middle nasal concha and meatus. Here, odorants are binding to the cilia, right, of the olfactory cells, those neurons there. Odorants are binding, sending information about smell on up into the central nervous system. As air, though, we continue to travel now through the internal nares and head into the nasopharynx. That's just the olfactory epithelium, all about smell, lining that superior nasal concha, where we have our receptors for smell. Okay. When it comes to the respiratory mucosa, we're thinking about pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar epithelium. Can you picture that? Is that from our, very good. Yeah, cilia, those cilia are moving what along? Mucus, right. Those cilia will even brush mucus back out of our nasal cavity down into our digestive tract so we can swallow stuff, get rid of it, okay? We need to. So cilia, bringing in or just moving the mucus around, contaminated mucus, right? And then there, that's secreting the mucus, are goblet cells. You've seen those fellows before, right? A lot of other very helpful components are being secreted here at this mucosa. We have lysozymes and defenses, lysozymes that will poke holes in the membranes of bacteria to kill them as they're trying to come into our respiratory tract. Okay? Defenses also are destroying bacteria so they don't hurt us, right? And then there's plexuses, there's capillaries and veins embedded in this respiratory epithelium, carrying warm blood. And that's how the air gets warm, as it's bumping up against this respiratory epithelium. Those nasal concha are swirling, the meatus are swirling that air around and warming it and moistening it up. So we can see those within the body, superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha and meatus. There's our olfactory epithelium. Cranial nerve 1. Okay. So, as we are breathing in air, again, we're getting warm and filtered, warmed and moistened. And then as we breathe out air, the body captures that heat coming, so we're not going to get rid of that heat or that moisture. The body will capture the heat and the moisture, and then we'll breathe out the air. Okay, so around our nasal cavity we have sinuses. Okay, so these are just chambers within the head. Right, so we have our frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary sinuses. Okay, these regions, these open chambers that there's mucus that's being secreted in them. They help to lighten the skull. They act as resonance chambers for the voice, okay? Kind of amplify our voices, and they're helping to warm and moisten the air as well. Pressure builds up in here, have a sinus headache, right?
Why does that happen a lot? why you get a lot of sinus pain, or can somebody get a lot of it?
It's just pressure building up.
Can this happen?
Yeah. Yeah, so just pressure building up inside of the head, inside of those sinuses.
But does that mean something could be wrong, or it's just?
It could be a dysfunction that's blocking, maybe mucus or something that gets blocked, and that can build up pressure. Could be what elevation we're at. Alright, you're in a plane, maybe that's gonna build up pressure. So our sinuses are located around the head, our frontal sinus, and then our ethmoid and sphenoidal sinuses. So once we then are leaving these internal nerves behind, the internal nerve behind the nasal cavity, we enter into the pharynx. And this is just a tube that's running from the base of the skull all the way down, okay? And it connects the nasal cavity to the mouth, to the oral cavity, and then eventually to the larynx we can go into, or the esophagus. Okay, so we can head into the respiratory tract down the larynx, or the digestive tract down the esophagus. The pharynx has three regions. Behind the nasal cavity is the nasopharynx. Behind the oral cavity is the oropharynx. And then behind the larynx is the laryngopharynx. At the larynx is the laryngopharynx. So we'll see this on our model. We're gonna have to be able to determine or to note that if anything, if a sticky is here, that's the, the sticky is here, that's the nasopharynx. Okay? And oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Okay? They can either lead us into the larynx or the esophagus. And here, we can try to make things out. That's the nasal cavity. That will be the internal nerves, or internal nerve that leads us into the nasopharynx, behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx, behind the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx, behind the larynx. And here's the lid to the larynx, the epiglottis. Let's see that. Here's the lid to the larynx. This is the epiglottis. And every time we swallow food, that pushes the epiglottis, the lid to the larynx, covers the epiglottis, closes it, so that food does not go down into our respiratory tract. Let's talk more about that as we get to the digestive tract. Okay. So that nasopharynx itself, we have still some ciliated, pseudophide, columnar epithelium. This is where we'll find our tonsils, our eustachian tubes, our pharyngotympanic tubes coming from the ears. We're joined here at the nasopharynx as well, from the ears. This is where we can get some drainage from the ears, and also some pressure being equalized. In the plane, anyone ever had her ears just really hurting? That's pressure at the pharyngotympanic, that tube, eustachian tube. And kids actually get ear infections often, right? That's because as we're younger, those are more flat than angled in order to drain well. And so for children, when they're flat, the buildup of infectious tough bacteria and so forth and secretions can cause an infection to build up. But as we get older, they'll start to angle and then they drain better, and we can get rid of all of that, and we have less ear infections as we're older.
Is that why some of the kids have to get like those little tubes inside the ear?
They'll drain, yeah. All right, so here we go. There's our nasal cavity. Okay. Again, the roof of the nasal cavity, ethmoid bone. Floor, the hard palate of the maxillary bone, and the soft palate as well. from which the uvula is hanging. All right, once we travel down the nasopharynx, behind the nasal cavity, we enter into the oropharynx, behind the oral cavity. Now food can join in, food and drink can join in with air, okay? So air is passing through the oropharynx as well, okay? And now food can enter in. And it has this tissue, now we have an even tougher tissue, stratified squamous epithelium. Okay. The opening to the oral cavity there at the pharynx is called the isthmus of Cauces. We'll talk more about that when we get to the respiratory tract. We see tonsils here as well. After we leave the oral pharynx, we head into the region of the pharynx that's leading us into the larynx. That is called the laryngopharynx. Still, now food and air are traveling through the laryngopharynx. And this is just taking the pharynx and dividing it into parts according to what structures it's behind. Either the nasopharynx, the oral cavity, oropharynx, or there at the larynx, the laryngopharynx. And so the laryngopharynx is going to, again, allow food and air to continue to travel. But here we make a decision. Are we gonna be air going into the larynx or food going back into the esophagus? All right. So now we're leaving the laryngopharynx. And as long as the top of the larynx and heading into the larynx, as long as the lid of the larynx is open, the epiglottis, we're gonna head into the larynx. We only want air to go in there. We don't want food to go in there, unless it can cause us to choke.
I said when some people like the older people, they tell you when they drink water, when they have, when they can't drink, thin liquids like water, they have their chin, make sure they have their chin, they put their chin to their chest, to make sure it goes to their.
Yes, I've never heard about that. Never seen that. But our larynx is also called our voice box. Well, thank you for the info. That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're trying to push it into the larynx.
You want to make sure it goes into the right place, because, there you can't drink like thin liquid.
All right,
Just
so
how big, the right place.
the larynx, also called the voice box, okay, is where we find our vocal cords, okay, helping to make our voices. Again, the larynx is extending from the laryngopharynx, okay, so that is gonna allow air, the laryngopharynx is gonna allow air to flow into the larynx. The larynx itself is attached to the hyoid bone. Remember the hyoid bone? The larynx will continue down, okay, and lead us into the trachea. And now we're getting closer and closer to the lungs. As we get to the trachea, we're getting closer to the lungs, and that's what we're trying to get to. This is the conduit, okay, that part of this respiratory system, the conducting zone. But we're getting air closer and closer and closer to the lungs. Okay, so the larynx is gonna get us closer to take us into the trachea. That would be closer to the lungs. Here at the larynx, we see some stratified squamous epithelium, as well as some superstratified ciliated columnar epithelium. I want you to picture those in your head. Can you see those?
Yeah.
Good. All right. All right, so now, let's backtrack. External nares, pathway of air. Sounds like a test question. Pathway of air, external nares, vestibule, nasal cavity, where we find the superior, middle, inferior, meata and concha, meata. Describe the function. To swirl air around and warm it and moisten it, or warm and moisten air. How many words is that? Warm and moisten air. 4 words. Don't write a paragraph. Okay? And then we leave the internal air, out of the internal air into the nasopharynx, down to the oropharynx. Now we're in this laryngopharynx. And here, as long as the lid to the larynx is up and open, that lid is called the epiglottis. We will head down into the larynx. Its opening is called the glottis. Its lid is called the above the glottis, the epiglottis. Okay? Again, every time we swallow, that epiglottis is pushed down over the glottis, the opening to the larynx, to close the larynx, so that that food can only go into the esophagus and not into our larynx, where it can choke us and go into the respiratory tract. Okay? We have cartilages here. We're bringing back the cartilage. Remember your hyaline cartilage? We have cartilages here at the larynx, hyaline cartilage. We have thyroid cartilage. And at the thyroid cartilage, we have the laryngeal prominence, which is our Adam's apple. Everyone touch their laryngeal prominence. Now, if I ask you to name this structure, you gonna tell me Adam's apple?
Yeah.
No, you don't. Laryngeal prominence. We also have some other cartilages associated with the larynx, cricoid cartilages. Okay. The arytenoid cartilages, cuneiform cartilages, and the corniculate cartilages. And all of these are necessary because they help to close the glottis, to close the opening of the larynx. Again, that epiglottis is the structure that will cover the glottis, closing the opening to the larynx, the glottis, as we swallow, so food does not enter into the respiratory tract. Okay, so here we are. Here's the larynx. You'll see this bottom. Here's the larynx. It's attached to the hyoid bone. We have the thyroid cartilage. At the thyroid cartilage, we have the laryngeal prominence. And then we have some other cartilages, the cricoid cartilage. We're gonna see from the back view some more cartilages. You can see the epiglottis kind of sticking up. The larynx will then lead us into the trachea, where the trachea has its own cartilages as well. So this is the model that we'll see when we get to the in lab. You'll see the larynx. There's the hyoid bone. There's thyroid cartilage with the laryngeal prominence. There's the cricoid cartilage. On our lung model, we'll have a little larynx structure. This other one is kind of huge. It's kind of big. Okay, so that'll be a bigger one to work with. The ones that are a part of the lung model that we'll see is a smaller structure to work with, but still, we can see the stuff here. We can see the laryngeal prominence and the thyroid cartilage. Okay, and then extending from the larynx, we will see the trachea, which is our next step in conducting air, getting closer and closer to the lungs. If we take a posterior view of the larynx, this model, we'll be able to see some other cartilages that are here in order to open and close the opening of the larynx, the glottis. Okay, we have the arytenoid cartilages here, and then attached to them and above, superior to them, are the corniculate cartilages. So the arytenoid here and here, and the corniculate here and here. And we'll see that, be able to distinguish them better when we're at the modeling class. Here's the actual larynx. Posterior view. There's the glottis, the opening to the larynx. There's the epiglottis, the lid that closes the glottis, closes the larynx. You can see some little cartilages here, the cricoid cartilage that comes all around, the arytenoid cartilage, and the corniculate cartilage attached. Corniculate with a crown-like point, the point like on a crown, pointy thing, piece of cartilage. Here at the larynx is where we have our vocal cords. Our true vocal cords that actually generate our voices are the vocal folds. The vocal folds are the true vocal cords. They are, they're at the glottis, okay? So they're kind of to an opening. And they open and close there, or the glottis opens and closes, and we'll see the vocal folds there as well. Okay, so they are attached to the arytenoid cartilages, contain elastic fibers, okay, so we can stretch. Besides these vocal folds, these true vocal cords, we also have false vocal cords, okay, that don't participate in generating our voices. They are called the vestibular folds. So they don't participate in any sound production. They're helping to close the glottis when we swallow. So let's find those. So you have to take kind of a sagittal section through the larynx. So this is kind of a sagittal section through the larynx. And then we're gonna look into the larynx. And there's the glottis. And then here's the epiglottis, the opening. The vocal folds are at the epiglottis, at the glottis, the opening. Okay? The vocal folds are the true vocal cords are here. And above them, we always find the vestibular folds. These are participating in opening and closing the glottis. The vocal folds, or the true vocal cords, are participating in generating sound in our voices. Let's find those on a model. This is the model that's attached to the lungs, that model there. So we can open this up and look inside, and we will see depicted here would be kind of with a white stripe on what will be the true vocal cords, which are called the vocal folds. And then above them would be the vestibular folds. Those are the false vocal cords. They participate in opening and closing the glottis, the opening to the larynx, like so. So here's the glottis. And at the glottis, we'll have our vocal folds, our true vocal cords in white. Above them are the vestibular folds. These are false vocal cords. They don't make any sound. They help to open and close the glottis. Which is the opening to the larynx. Go down into the larynx. Make our way down into the larynx through the glottis. Okay, we say hi to our vocal folds and our vestibular folds, and make our way down into the glottis. Now, we can close our glottis and build up air with our glottis closed, so air can't move, but we can build up pressure in our thoracic cavity. And when we do that, that's the Valsalva's maneuver. Okay, so there's many points in life that we are performing the Valsalva's maneuver. Okay, so that's to build up the pressure in the thoracic cavity without letting any air move, closing the glottis, and we can do this, right? And that'll build up pressure, that'll push down on the abdominal pelvic regions, right? In order to help eliminate, during contractions, okay, a woman uses this maneuver in order to push, okay? So like her breath, it's right, so holding the breath is closing the glottis. So we close the glottis, okay? The epiglottis will only get pushed down when you swallow and cover it. Yeah, good question. Here we rely on those vestibular folds that close that glottis. All right, we leave the larynx and we head into the trachea, getting closer to the lungs. The trachea we call the windpipe. Right? It has its own cartilages, tracheal cartilages. They're C-shaped. They ring the trachea. There are, these cartilage rings are connected to each other through these ligaments in between them, called annular ligaments. There's trachealis, the muscle here, that, is attached to the cartilage rings, and that's going to contract when we cough, and help to push air or mucus, expel mucus. The trachea would then branch, and the place where it branches is called the carina. And at that tracheal carina, we will branch into the left and right bronchi. Now we're gonna head into the lungs. Okay, so here we are, there's the larynx. Now we're down in the trachea. Again, this is the conducting zone. We're conducting air, getting air into the respiratory zone. So now we're in the trachea. Okay, and at the carina here is where we get the branching of the trachea into the left and right bronchi. The trachea itself has its mucosa, its deep internal tissue, mucus secreting tissue, mucosa, where we have ciliated stratified epithelium with goblet cells secreting mucus. There's the submucosa, that's going to be kind of deeper to the mucosa, and you gotta think that this is a tube, okay? So when we say deep, we actually mean moving this way. Like this is the lumen of the tube. Going deep is going more into the body, okay? All right, because this is it's external environment traveling through us, right? So really the external layer is what we would think of as internal, okay? But it is, okay? The mucosa is external and is external and the environment running through us, okay? Where the air is traveling, okay? And then we go deeper into the body, the next layer would be the submucosa. And then even deeper to that would be the adventitia, the tissue anchoring that to two structures in the body. And anytime you take a section through the trachea, you're likely gonna get some esophagus with it. And we saw that a lot probably on our slides when we looked at these tissues, when we're looking at the hyaline cartilage. We'd always take the trachea slide to see hyaline cartilage. There was esophagus there as well, probably. So here's the trachea, hyaline cartilage. Okay, there's the lumen of the trachea. Okay, so here's the mucosa. That's in contact with the environment running through, the air running through. And then deeper is the submucosa. And then even deepest is the adventitia, connective tissue anchoring this to the internal structures in the body. Some pseudostratified columnar epithelium, we've seen this with cilia. We've seen this before. We've seen these before. Remember these? They're cilia. Now we're at the trachea. Now let's get into the lungs. Let's go into the bronchial tree. Starting at those bronchi. Okay? So as we see, the bronchial tree is actually continuously branching. We have 23 orders of branching that occur until finally we get to where gas exchange will occur. What happens? So the trachea first divides into the two bronchi, left and right bronchi, and then those divide, and then those divide, and divide 23 times, 23 orders of branching or division, dividing these conduits. And finally we get to the respiratory zone. All right, we're still at the trachea, now we're headed into the bronchi. The trachea has divided into the right and left bronchi. Bronchus, singular, right bronchus, left bronchus. And now we're bringing air that has been cleansed, warmed, moistened, through the conduits, all the passages that we travel through. And we're bringing it to this, what's gonna be the bronchial tree, where again, we get 23 orders of branching that occur until we finally leave the conducting zone and enter the respiratory zone. And go through a few more structures before we get to the sites of gas exchange. So the conducting zone, okay? here's the larynx, right? So we went from, thinking about the nose, we traveled all the way back behind in the nasal pharynx, down the pharynx, into the larynx, and into the trachea. And then we divide into the right and left bronchi. Uh-oh. Here's a pathway, trachea, arrow, right and left, main bronchi, also called the primary bronchi. The main bronchi, primary bronchi. Each bronchus, right and left, will enter the hilum, okay? The region of the lung where these two bronchi enter. Okay? We also have the big pulmonary veins entering the lungs there. We talked about that. We're gonna talk about that when we talk about the heart, lab C. We talked about that, lab A, right? We'll see the pulmonary arteries actually entering the lungs, right? We'll see the pulmonary veins exiting the lungs and go back to the heart at the hilum. Those main bronchi, the primary bronchi, the right and left primary bronchi are going to start branching as well. And they're gonna branch into the lobar or secondary bronchi. The right lung gets 3 of these secondary bronchi. The left lung gets 2 of these secondary bronchi because the left lung has 2 lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes. So each lobe gets one of these lobar or secondary bronchi. From the bronchi, we're gonna continue and into the secondary bronchi. So the primary bronchi, the left and right bronchi, will branch into the secondary or lobar bronchi. 3 on the right, 1, 2, 3, 2 on the left, 1, 2 on the left, okay? Those on, we're not done branching. We gotta branch, and branch some more. Our next level of branching gets us to our segmental bronchi. So those secondary lobar bronchi will branch into, on the right, 10 segmental or tertiary, third order of branching, tertiary bronchi on the right, 10 of them, and on the left, 8 of them. Each of these segmental or tertiary bronchi is going to supply or bring in air into the bronchiopulmonary segments. So each of our lobes is further divided into segments, bronchiopulmonary segments. Okay? If there's any disease in the lung, a bronchiopulmonary segment can be removed and the lung will still function just fine. Okay? Just lose some lung tissue. That's how disease can be removed. The whole bronchial segment is removed. Each bronchial segment is being serviced or air is brought into it by the tertiary bronchi. Which are also called the segmental bronchi, and those continue to branch and branch some more. So there's the trachea. We divide into the right and left primary bronchi, and we head into the hilum of the lungs, the region of the lungs where the bronchi puncture and enter in. Okay? And then those divide into our secondary or segmental bronchi. Okay? So we get 3 on the right, 2 on the left. And then those divide into tertiary bronchi. 10 on the right, 8 on the left. And then finally, those tertiary bronchi are going to change into bronchioles. Just like our arteries turn into arterioles, our bronchi turn into bronchioles. So those segmental bronchi are gonna divide and divide and divide until we finally get into our primary bronchioles. And then those primary bronchioles are gonna divide into terminal bronchioles. And then finally, we are at the end of the conducting zone. Once we get to these terminal bronchioles, we're done at the conducting zone, and as air, we get delivered into the respiratory zone. Okay, we get delivered into the respiratory zone. Each one of these terminal bronchioles, the very last branch of the conducting zone, is going to service or deliver air into the very small lobules of the lungs. So we go from lobes of the lungs to bronchial pulmonary segments of the lungs. And finally, we get to little lobules of the lungs. When we get to the lung model, it kind of depicts the lobules for us. Okay? But every lobule is serviced by a terminal bronchiole. And the terminal bronchiole is carrying air to each lobule gets a terminal bronchiole bringing air into it.
You have a picture of the terminal bronchiole?
No, I got pictures.
No, this is it.
It's just that we here with it. Okay, so from the bronchi, just thinking about the tissue now. When we go from the bronchi to bronchi and into the lungs to the bronchioles, we're gonna see differences in the structures there, in the tissue there. The bronchi, we have cartilages still coming, the trachea has cartilages, the bronchi still have cartilage associated with them. Okay, but as we change from bronchi to bronchioles, we lose the cartilage. The cartilage starts to disappear. Okay? The epithelium starts to change, okay, from a pseudostratified columnar epithelium into cuboidal epithelium. We start to lose the cilia as we become bronchioles. Cilia disappear. Goblet cells disappear. So now we're not so worried about secreting mucus. Okay? And we get more smooth muscle now. The smooth muscle is going to constrict those bronchioles. Okay? And control the flow of air into the lungs. I'm on deck. Okay. Okay. So we see a change from the bronchi, where we have hyaline cartilage surrounding these bronchi to give them nice structure. We still have some ciliated pseudostratified epithelium that's ciliated with some cartilage around it. And then when we change to a bronchiole, we lose the cartilage. We become more cuboidal, surrounded more now by smooth muscle, so we can constrict these bronchioles and control the flow of air. Once we are at the terminating bronchioles, we are then entering into the respiratory zone. The respiratory zone. And that's going to take us into another set of bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles. That will take us through a few more passageways until we get to the alveoli, where we're gonna have gas exchange. We're almost there. In the respiratory zone, which is defined by the presence of those alveoli, little round structures where gas exchange is happening. So, at the end of the conducting zone, we end at terminal bronchioles. After we do all that branching, at the end of the conducting zone, now we head into the respiratory zone. Air gets delivered into the respiratory bronchioles of the respiratory zone. And then air travels through the alveolar ducts. And then air travels into an alveolar sac. And then air is delivered into individual alveoli. Many respiratory bronchioles that divide into these alveolar ducts. And at each duct leads us into an alveolar sac. And at the alveolar sac, we have a bunch of alveoli. Each will have, so the alveolar duct is going to have about 5 or 6 alveolar sacs associated with it. And then those are gonna contain, those sacs contain an individual alveoli, where we will have the site of gas exchange with the blood that's coming in from the heart. The heart is delivering, bringing blood into the lungs. And it's there, we're gonna have gas exchange with the blood and the blood vessels. I mean, the very small, thin-walled capillaries by the time you get to alveoli. Where capillaries in the blood circulatory system, and those, and we'll see how we get gas exchange happen. Okay, so let's take a look. Here we go. Respiratory zone. We've been delivered. Conducting zone still, but we branch and branch and branch until finally a terminal bronchial of the conducting zone, the last part of the conducting zone, delivers us into the respiratory zone, starting at our respiratory bronchioles. And then those deliver us as air into the alveolar ducts. These are the ducts. And then those ducts take us into an alveolar sac. And at the sac, we have a whole bunch of alveoli. So it looks like a bunch of grapes. This histology picture tries to show us a respiratory bronchial that then branches or takes us into branches into alveolar ducts. Here's an alveolar duct. Here's an alveolar duct. An alveolar duct will lead us into an alveolar sac. You just gotta pick out things that we would call a sac here. Okay? I'll call this a sac. I'll call this a sac. But at each alveolar sac, we have individual alveoli. So now I'm gonna pick something that looks like one little structure, an alveolus, an alveolus, an alveolus.
So the little structures are alveolus, and then ones that look all humped together.
Yeah, those will be the sacs. The ones that look long and open will be the ducts. So let's look at this one. Nice, long and open, that's an alveolar duct. A bunch of grapes, an alveolar sac. One individual grape, an alveolus. Okay? Long passageway, an alveolar duct. Oh, this looks like something that would be at the lab practical, sitting in front of me, yes?
With like conditions like asthma, these are the parts of the lungs that are usually affected, right?
This is the, say again?
With conditions like asthma, these are the parts of the lungs that are usually affected.
So
like
this
the
is where we're gonna
alveoli.
talk about that, yeah, so with asthma, we're affecting those bronchioles, okay? They're like constricted and we need to open them up, making it hard to breathe. So we're gonna talk about these dysfunctions in a minute. Thank you for bringing that up. You got a question, Anthony? Let's go. You got a question? Okay. All right, the alveoli, look at this. We have about 150 million 150 million alveoli per lung. Okay? And right out the alveoli, we have the blood, the circulatory system is there via capillary systems. Our very small, thin-walled, the smallest of our blood vessels, thin-walled. Okay? So that's gonna help for gas to easily cross out of the blood and get into the thin-walled alveoli. The alveoli, thin wall, we're talking about simple squamous epithelium, thin, delicate. Gas can cross right through these walls. Okay? There's some elastic tissue that surrounds the alveoli, each alveoli. That's going to help the shape of the alveolus as we're breathing in and out. It helps to maintain its shape. We don't want the alveolus to collapse on itself, because that can lead to a lung collapse. So we want the alveolus, each individual alveoli to stay nice and open. Okay? If they start to collapse on themselves, that can cause lung collapse.
That's like the smokers. What's collapsing?
No, not lung collapse. Smokers is gonna damage that tissue. A smoker's lung